Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo.
And we're going to be concluding 1984 by George Orwell.
As always, you can reach out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, Deep Dive Book Club on Patreon, and pretty much everywhere else. We're out there. You can find us. For anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we have read or books that we are in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction books. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we want to include you in the conversation. So, to start us off, Joel, and continuing our conversation on 1984 and the various topics in there, I wanted to start today's episode with discussing the character Julia. Julia camouflages herself as an Orthodox party member, but in reality, she rebels against the regime by carrying out a series of secret sexual relationships. Julia uses her sexuality to rebel against the sexual puritanism of Ingsoc, and she uses the intense effort of maintaining her camouflage and protecting her secret relationships to keep herself sane and to exercise her cleverness as a covert way of expressing her individuality. She seems to embody a contradiction. She is fiercely determined to survive, but continuously takes increasingly risky actions that risk her very survival. So what do you think of Julia's peculiar form of rebellion?
Julia herself shines through, as many critics thought, as Sonia, which was Orwell's second wife. Julia's form of rebellion here is the same as Winston's, which is probably why we have the two characters coming together in the story, where her real rebellion is individualism, where she is going against the party's norms as a way to assert her being alive.
To resist the fact that she is one of the dead, to resist the fact that she doesn't have any control over her external life.
And I think that that's one of those double-think narratives that we have where everyone in the party says out loud, oh yes, this is wrong, oh yes, we need to do things this way. Meanwhile, in her sexual escapades, we have the other people that she's sleeping with also saying the same thing out loud. The party's good, party's great, we're doing all this. Meanwhile, secretly subterfuging the individualism inside of it. And that, I think, harkens to our humanity. We're just always going to be human. There's no way of suppressing that.
She's kind of, in a way, embodying that feeling of wanting to do something specifically because you're told not to do it. Embodying just living that out. You know, there's a sexual purity and there's anti-sex leagues in the book. She is ironically a member of the anti-sex league. They're just trying to abolish the sexual instinct in humanity, the way the party is directing them, but she leans in the exact opposite direction. She's fully embracing it, which is, for a book at the tail end of the 1940s, is an interesting character to cast and portray. Very interesting.
Quite scandalous, even prior to the sexual liberation of the 1970s.
The other question that naturally occurs to me here is, why did she begin the relationship with Winston? This is another instance where a character goes through a lot of effort to do something, to make something happen. She plans it out. She does a whole cute meet where she accidentally bumps into him and slips him a little piece of paper. And on the little piece of paper, it's written in a poor handwriting that says, "I love you." It's just, that's what it is. That's how she starts it. And there's a long amount of time that passes between their interactions and before they actually get to the point of beginning to have a relationship with each other. But she singles him out, and she says essentially that I could tell by looking at you and watching you that you're not one of them, that you think independently, which terrifies Winston while also flattering him.
How do you stand out in a society that strives for uniformity? I think even in the League of Anti-Sexuality, abolishing sexuality in the human nature is in itself trying to remove any unforeseen parameters that you can't control, because sexual drive, lust, or all of these things do add towards an emotional being an individual, and therefore being a complex parameter that is much harder to control. And so Winston there is flattered because he gets to stand out, but also fearful because standing out means death. So if she can tell, that means other people can tell. Is she also a thought police? Who knows? So each person is taking a risk in initiating that relationship, because either one could be the secret police.
And this time going through this book, just like I came to the theory that Winston initiates the diary to be his form of suicide, Julia, both in initiating the relationship with Winston, but then also further pursuing it and keeping it going and keeping it alive, is also kind of choosing her own way of going out, because she can't keep it up forever. She can't keep up the secret escapades and the double life forever. And she knows it at one level. And on the other level, because she is, I think, a decade or more younger than Winston, she also is exhibiting her own form of doublethink where, no, I'm going to outwit them forever. I'm just going to always outpace them. But at another level, she knows the game can't last forever. If not initially, that eventually this is her way of going out. Because they have candid conversations about it. It's like, yeah, eventually we're both going to get caught. Eventually they're going to torture and kill us.
We're all choosing our own form of suicide, even if that's living to an old age and dying quietly. We're marching towards that death, and we take risk along the way. Even getting in a car and driving is its own risk. Usually a risk most people are willing to take, but a risk nonetheless.
And it is a little bit of a minor act of doublethink in that we get into probably the most dangerous thing we can get into, which is a car, and drive it around, the most dangerous activity we could probably do, but also feel perfectly safe.
And we have plenty of humans engaging in risky behavior, whether that be scuba diving, skydiving, rock climbing, caving, any number of things that could risk life and limb. And part of that is choosing the level of risk that you want in order to feel alive. Because to sit at home on the couch and never have any risk is to not be alive. And I think here Julia is exhibiting her own form of control in her life through this means, by utilizing one of the only things that she has, which is her body.
And her mind. Winston is continually surprised and tells Julia as much that she is much more cunning than him. She's more clever, more creative and inventive. Winston is kind of like walking a tightrope with his private life of just like having a diary and having his own private thoughts. And that's about the extent to which he can handle, and he constantly feels like he's on the cliff edge doing just that. And then he meets Julia and gets to know Julia and all the things that she's done. And her secret life and her rebellion is much more involved and much more complex. And she puts a lot more thought and effort into it. You know, finding places to meet, finding contraband items to partake of, and knowing all the different routes and coming up with different intricate plans of how to meet safely, how to depart safely, directions, locations, who to trust, who to ignore. And he's astounded by that. And he's like, okay, she is much more cunning than me. I think that also plays into the two different ways that they see the party, which I think was a very interesting contrast between them. Because again, Julia is much younger and she's grown up in a world where it's only been the party. She doesn't remember a time before the party. Winston in his childhood does. And he clings to these pre-regime glimmers of memory of the world that's gone. And she doesn't know any better. So she doesn't question that the party might not be forever. Winston, on the other hand, does. That is a thought that occurs to Winston. It's not a thought that occurs to Julia. And she's okay with that. And he's just kind of dumbfounded by that she doesn't think about that and that she's not really interested in it.
Well, even when they're reading the book that's written in opposition to the party.
Yeah, the supposed Immanuel Goldstein book.
Julia doesn't really care about theory. She even falls asleep while he's reading the book to her. She has no interest in that.
Right.
So Although she's more clever in certain aspects, she has no interest in theoretical writing or political theories that are put forth here. Whereas Winston is very heavily.
Yeah, he agonizes over it, and she's just like, oh, that's kind of boring.
Yeah.
And they're both rebelling, though. Any other thoughts here on Julia and their relationship, how she thinks? Fascinating character. I really like her character. And she's definitely, in my opinion, more likable and interesting than Winston. Winston is, we meet a man on the edge of defeat, and he just kind of stays there and kind of follows the story to its end. Right? Ready for the next one? Okay, let's talk about science. Scientific and technical progress have mostly ceased in the world of 1984, partly because of the constant warfare, but also because progress, quote, depended on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society, end quote. Other than improvements in mass surveillance, experiment and invention have largely stopped in the world of Oceania. So as a scientist, Joel, what do you think about the loss of empirical thinking and why it is incompatible with the society of Oceania?
I think we talked about it pretty thoroughly in the in-person book club, where the idea of creativity or the development of science, which is studying what is and inventing what is not, requires that individualism, that uniqueness, that creativity to explore the bounds of both society, physics, chemistry, and the like, that in order to reduce people's ability to have what's called divergent thinking, you must simultaneously suppress the individual, and that will reduce the ability to create. In addition, if the party says the world is as good as it can ever be, and you should be completely happy and complacent, complacency does not provide the avenue for invention. The only way that we invent things is we see a need to fulfill.
And that's incompatible with not being able to think outside of the way other people are thinking.
Well, the party suppresses both individual thought, so the capability of having those creative ideas, as we see in Winston's journal being his death sentence. But also, if there's a need for an invention, that means that the society isn't perfect. But the society can't be not perfect because the party takes care of everything for you.
It's probably also a bit of a hierarchy of needs situation where even though everything's supposedly copacetic, they're barely getting by. There's always shortages on food and various necessities. Razors, I think there's a constant theme of there being a shortage of razors. Just everyday items not able to be found or scavenged. Say that Orwell's prediction there of the loss of empirical thinking in a highly regimented society is accurate, because in our timeline, the Soviet Union still had scientific advances, regardless of being highly oppressive and regimented.
The Soviet Union had pretty impressive technological advancements, but that's also because that they had pushed that forward and had very amazing scientists with access to a high amount of resources. Those resource aggregations were deleterious to perhaps the overall populace, but not to the scientists themselves. In fact, the Soviet Union had a failed project where they intended on building a science city where everything was going to be architecturally designed to provide for scientific discoveries.
I remember this, yeah.
In that case, we don't see Orwell's extremity in totalitarianism where everything is suppressed and everything is controlled to a unrealistic level. But we do see the general population being suppressed while having a branch of that society to progress scientific structure in a not controlled manner, but a directed manner. Think of the space race or the space technology. They were directed, but not controlled.
Right. Yeah, that's a good distinction.
In that regard, I think we see the development of technology and the advancement there, regardless of what form of government is involved. So I don't know. I don't know that if you oppress that, if you stop having technological advancements. I think there's a large argument in our society today about what should be government directed and what should be privately directed. I think one of the big arguments that probably won't be solved in our lifetime is, for example, healthcare. Should healthcare be exclusively a private sector or exclusively a public sector? And how do you handle that? Because many people are on the side of capitalism, meaning, if you just let a complete free market, the best solution will be found by mercenary business people.
Something similar that this reminds me of when we're talking about public policy and how much to be government directed, how much to be privately directed. I think I was reading about this in Thinking Fast and Slow, where entrepreneurs and small businesses, how much should the government invest in small businesses and loan to small businesses, knowing that the majority of small businesses and new businesses fail. A large amount of them fail, but the ones that succeed, they run the risk. They run a chance of being wildly successful and beneficial for everyone. There's also the idea of entrepreneurial martyrism, where the first couple of business forays into a new sector or new way of taking a technology or industry often fail and cost resources and investors money, but ultimately benefit the larger society, and future businesses and that follow in that line are more successful and do greater good for the economy. That's an interesting debate of how much to be directed top down and how much to be supported top down. Fully is undoable, but is zero the right answer? Hard to say.
I think if we have zero, then you just end up developing oligarchy.
Anarcho-capitalism?
Yeah.
Any more thoughts on the realm of science and empirical thinking in the world of 1984?
I don't think so. I don't think that the idea of empirical thought or scientific invention was the most accurate portrayal inside of Orwell's works, but I don't need that to be.
Right.
I think Orwell had more direct connection to thinkers and in life experiences that led him to understand politics and economics better, because he was truly invested in that, seeing as how he went and volunteered in the Spanish Civil War. He probably had lots and lots of thoughts and feelings in those realms, and he does a really great job of highlighting those themes throughout 1984, but I don't think he quite highlights the scientific or technological aspects in this thought experiment that he has. But I don't need him to, and it's perfectly fine the way that he wrote it.
Right, and it makes sense within the logic of the world itself. It's not contradictory to its own internal narrative. Next, let's move on to poverty and ignorance. And here I want to read out an excerpt from the book that was supposedly by Goldstein. And this is a passage that is on the necessity of economic inequality for the party's survival. Quote, "If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. If leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance." End quote. And this is an instance where it's important to know where Orwell came from and his own thrust of political beliefs. This is very much him painting a stark picture of how he saw the world functioning in his own time and the role he saw of poverty and ignorance in his own time in promulgating inequality and just perpetuating it.
Well, I think when he grew up in India in the early 1900s, he got to see that structure. When he was a part of the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, He probably got to see that structure. And he further had very strong feelings in that realm since he was a devout socialist looking to bring up workers' rights and workers' unions and what we would say the proletariat class, as opposed to the previous development of both oligarchies and feudalism and everything else.
He also had an intimate knowledge of the effects of crushing poverty on people at a personal level, from at least from my experience of reading Road to Wigan Pier, where he goes and visits these families, he talks to them, he visits these towns of coal miners and watching how their lives are spent, how their money is spent, what effects their jobs and poverties are having on them. And he just lays it all out matter-of-factly, and he's doing this himself, visiting them himself. It's a fascinating and dark read, but he's intimately aware of what poverty is doing to people.
Right. Quite deplorable. And you see these people working extremely hard, but having very little return value from the society that they are holding up.
Right. The economy at the time desperately needed, and the military desperately needed these coal miners to do their jobs, but they were definitely bottom tier as far as social priority.
Right. And we saw that in Britain, and we also saw that in America, where the coal miners of West Virginia were not only suppressed in their unions, but were actively shot at, bombed, and National Guard as well as the National Guard as well as private mercenary groups were hired in order to terrorize, kill, and in some cases disappear leaders of those coal miner unions. See the Battle of Blair Mountain, for example, which is actually one of the first historically recorded bombings from airplanes, where they had planes fly over and drop homemade pipe bombs. There was a huge suppression of that because of how much the society needed that coal. Crushing poverty.
Same thing happens to the proletariat in the novel. He says that the party just disappears any proles that get a little too intellectual or seem to be thinking a little bit more than they should.
Slightly digressing off this, but still part of the discourse that Orwell is setting up here is that poverty, and you could almost say slave class, and its role in society. In almost every society that we've developed, there is some level of laborer that is below specialized jobs, and they often get less resources than specialized jobs, i.e. you have different sociological classes.
Essentially, you're saying any society that has developed, that achieved surplus resources, those resources were never divvied up equally
Distributed, right?
Especially not to the people who were doing the main resource gathering or generating.
Could you even have a society that has an equal distribution of resources?
I don't know that we've seen an example in recorded history, so I don't think so. I don't think there's an escape from
inequality.
Right. I don't know that there's a way to have a society of any real scale that does not have some form of inequality, even if you can get it as benign as possible, but I don't see how you could not have a form of inequality. It's very difficult for me to imagine.
Right. It's difficult for me to imagine too. Maybe they can achieve it later, but I will say in a large group society, I think we're getting better. At least that's my hope, that we're increasing the amount of resources being provided to all people in a society.
There's always the forward-looking futurist optimism of, this new technology or this new innovation will provide so much excess resources and wealth or reduction in labor that everyone's going to be some form of wealthy, or everyone's going to have more time or resources or whatever it is. We haven't seen it yet. The Industrial Revolution, they said that, and conditions only got worse for the bottom rung of society. They worked more. They were treated less human. Agricultural revolution resulted in more stratification of societies. So I don't know. I think a line that captures it pretty well, what we're talking about, is this is also a line from the Goldstein book, is that inequality was the price of civilization. I think that's what we've been circling around in so many words.
And it's hard to disagree with that. I can't imagine a society where there is not some level of inequality. Like you said, you can make it as banal as possible, but there's still an inadequate distribution of resources.
And this makes me think of the idea that's been kind of thrown in and out of the spotlight in the past couple of years is universal basic income, where the idea is, well, we're generating so much resources and wealth overall, let's go ahead and just redistribute some of that wealth as a form of just income for being a citizen, just for existing as a citizen, to alleviate kind of everyday needs so you can focus on being happier and more productive in general. I haven't seen it happen yet in our country.
Besides Alaska.
Right. You just get paid to be an Alaskan.
One of the perspectives I really liked from, and I forget the economist I was reading this about, but universal basic income ends up becoming the result of shared productivity increase through automation. So, for example, in our capitalistic society, you don't reward the fast food workers that are replaced by robots that now accomplish their jobs. Those workers are displaced, but they don't gain any value from that automation production, only the owner. So ownership is rewarded, not hard work in our society. So a way of redistributing that structure where the ownership is rewarded is you, like you said, take some of that excess production that's caused by technology and automation and redistribute it as a kind of patchwork or band-aid for reallocating the value of ownership in a capitalistic society. So that's a perspective I like to think about universal basic income as. Not necessarily we're just giving away tax money to things. It's more of all of these super rich investors have benefited from automation, and now we're slightly redistributing that capability of production. Although I don't think we'll get away from inequality as the price of civilization.
I don't know that that's possible. No matter how well an idea like universal basic income would be implemented, I just don't see that. I just don't see a way for there not to be some form of inequality. Even though we are making progress and there are advances, I just don't see it. So let's move on to, we'll still talk about Goldstein, but there's a brief mention of something called the central secret. And this is another excerpt here from the book supposedly written by Goldstein. Quote, "As we have seen, the mystique of the party, and above all the inner party, depends on doublethink. But deeper than this lies the original motive, the never-questioned instinct that first led to the seizure of power and brought doublethink, the thought police, continuous warfare, and all other necessary paraphernalia into existence afterwards. This motive really consists ... end quote. And this, we never get to see the end of this in the book, because this is right when Winston gets interrupted. I believe he falls asleep before he can finish reading this, and then the next thing he knows, he is arrested. And then the end of his story begins. So, Joel, this is a tantalizing, dangling fruit over the reader's head. What do you think this central secret is? I've got my ideas, but I want to hear yours.
I don't know when I was reading it. I don't know when we talked about it, and I still don't know now. I think it is going to be one of those things where it just remains that ambiguous illumination to allow for you to fill in your deepest, darkest fears. It's the darkness upon which you can paint your own monster.
And I will do just that.
Go for it. Paint me the monster.
I think, after having read this now for the third time, I think that the ... stands in for the acquisition of power itself, and that Orwell was doing this as a literary flourish because it was such a banal statement, but that it was true, and that an instance like this, the thing that is underlying all of this is the pursuit of more power. I think it was as simple as that. I think the big dark secret of the party is just power hunger.
Power begets the greed for more power.
Right. I think that's it. I think it's as simple as that.
We should be afraid of. In fact, our founding fathers of America also felt the same way, which is why there is the idea of terms, of changing administration, of having a slow-moving government to reduce the aggregation of centralized power, right? The distribution of responsibilities.
It's definitely something that's baked into our system. Right now, I'm listening to the audiobook version of an in-depth biography of George Washington, and I just got to the early parts of the Revolutionary War shortly after he's named a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And the Continental Congress at the time, they were flying high on the fumes of revolutionary ideals and republicanism and representation and having the population choose for itself. But they were in a war situation, and in war situations, you need to concentrate power to get decisions made quickly. You need a clear chain of command, and you don't have time for a whole council to make a decision. And there's this constant tension that you see with Washington being like, well, I want to be able to do this, that, and the other, and I need to be able to make decisions quicker. Can I have a little bit more power to do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? And you see the Continental Congress anguishing over that. Well, the whole reason, supposedly, that we're fighting this war is to preserve freedom and to fight against despotism and authoritarianism. But the commander-in-chief of a revolutionary army that's running around the countryside needs to be able to make decisions and have enough power to effectively get done what he needs to get done. So it's a beautiful tension to watch play out in that setting. It's fascinating.
I love that idea in getting further away from our central question here.
We're talking about power, the acquisition of power, and its effect on people.
I really enjoyed the perspective for Alexander the Great invading Persia, where you have the great king of the Persian Empire far away who has to send his commands to the viceroys or the governors of the different provinces that are dealing with Alexander's invasion.
Satraps. They're called satraps. Fun Persian word.
That's great. I don't expect our listeners to know that word.
I'm the fun word
it's
came to mind, and I wanted to
word.
share it. Keep telling me about the king of Persia.
His commands take weeks in order for him to move his little chess pieces around. Meanwhile, Alexander is in the army itself, meaning that he can make decisions immediately right then and there and respond to the events that are happening. And that flow of communication reminds me of what you're talking about, of having the U.S. Army, the Revolutionary Army at the time, running around the countryside, trying to make decisions rapidly, because that's the only way that you can deal with that. Meanwhile, the Redcoats, or the British Army at the time, still has their central command over across the Atlantic Ocean. And although they have stand-ins for that chain of command, and they have more centralization.
Right. And then the instance of an emergency or war, like we said, fear and necessity usually leads people to lean a little bit more authoritarian. One more note on the Washington aside there is the main issue he was bumping into, at least as far as to the point of the story I'm in now, is that he couldn't name his own officers. That different militias and regiments elected their own officers, and that caused a problem because it was not based off of merit and ability. It was based off of familiarity and popularity. Definitely caused some problems.
So in the way that the party wants to beget more power as it claims even further power, I could see that being the deep, dark creature that lurks with the glowing eyes here, because Orwell does not make it distinct as to what that is. He puts that hanging cliff note right there as Winston gets taken away to a very deep, dark place that is full of the deepest fears a person could have. Literally.
Right. Another thing I wanted to point out about this particular section is that it occurs in the actual middle of the novel itself. If you were to grab the book off the shelf and split it in the middle, you're probably going to land on about this section. So it is central both in location and probably in thought as to motivations for the party itself. I'm saying I think he did it on purpose.
Yeah.
Another question that occurs to me about the book by Goldstein is why O'Brien gave it to him in the first place.
So that Orwell could insert his political essays in there in a very fast stream manner.
Right. And I'm not the only one to have this theory. I was reading that a particular political historian described the Goldstein writings as, quote, a non-fiction essay about the demon power, meaning the demon named power. I like that description.
It's a good description. So I think it is just a literary tool Orwell uses in order to provide the essays in a direct manner, right? Because he can pretty much just copy and paste that into this fiction book to make it more palatable to readers, which usually a fictional book is more palatable and easier to transcribe those messages. So to have these snippets in there is much easier. I think we also saw that in Dostoevsky's writings, where you could see where his ideas and direct almost essays bubble up to the surface under a very thin layer of a story, and then the book narrative dives back down into the fictional world. But I also think it's a plot device in order to provide the structure for what comes after Winston reads the book, which is explaining the control of the population by the party.
And then the other choice that Orwell makes that I don't know how much it bears diving into, but the fact that the book is supposedly written by Emmanuel Goldstein, but is said to have been written by inner party members that's just made up. It's another interesting twist to the whole existence of this fictitious book. Any other thoughts here on the book? Within the book?
No. I thought it was good.
All right. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to jump into discussing perceptions of reality.
We're back from our break, and we're going to skip the news speak. Meanwhile, we'll get into reality. What is reality? From the book O'Brien, quote, you believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else, not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes and in any case soon perishes. End quote.
This conversation, this monologue, takes place towards the very end of the book when the character O'Brien is got Winston strapped down to a table and torturing him in various ways, and is putting the final touches on breaking Winston's mind. And here he's cracking Winston's idea of what reality is itself. And this is a fun part to jump into and talk about how much of reality is external versus internal. And we kind of touched on this with the idea of resistance. If you go stand in the middle of a store and start shouting obscenities or saying rude things, that people will give you some resistance and check that behavior and let you know it's unacceptable. So what do you think, Joel? How much of our reality, as it's made up, as our minds constructed, is external versus internal? According to O'Brien here, it's whatever he says it is.
It's a very difficult question. Reality is so tied up in our perception, but our perception is so colored by everything around us, from our society to the language that we speak to education and what other people see and believe.
Some people would say that perception is all our reality is.
We have an event happen in the world. We'll take a tsunami or rainfall. Is that from a natural occurrence? Is that from some deity creating that? Whatever the society believes becomes that reality in itself. And that's all wrapped up in perception. But in that case, it's externalized in a societal way of looking at something. Or is it internalized? And we could talk about orthodoxy in the book, and they discuss orthodoxy in 1984, meaning orthodoxy is not thinking. It's the opposite. When it becomes unconscious, that in itself is orthodoxy. In fact, quote, orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconscious, end quote. And I think that's kind of the idea of reality that we have Orwell showing us.
The kind of reality that O'Brien is saying, this is all there is. It is what the party says it is. O'Brien at one point tells him during one of the torture sessions that, Winston, if I told you I'm going to levitate and you believed I was levitating, then I've in fact levitated, regardless of whatever else may or may not be happening. He just conveniently chooses not to levitate, but the point still stands that, Winston, if you believe it, then it's reality.
I think Orwell makes a very powerful argument here for what reality is. It's just a shared external agreement as to what has happened.
So if I'm hearing you, it sounds like you're leaning more to reality is externally validated. You can't have your perceptions on your own. It takes the collective around you to help shape what reality is. And I guess that's also circling around the idea of reality as a shared narrative.
We're a herd animal, so whatever our reality is a shared reality. You can have a reality of one, right? A truth of one, a world of one. That's great and all, but that'll never continue. That'll never exist. You'll become an unperson, in the words of 1984, right?
And that's exactly what O'Brien tells him, is that you're clinging to something to the utmost ephemerality. It will just not, it just can't exist. We have the reality. We will outlive you. The party will outlive me. Just give in to the greater picture. This is the greater picture. Why are you clinging to this brief, futile existence that will be utterly erased? So you and O'Brien would say reality is whatever the narrative is, whatever the group says it is. And that's like what Winston is bumping up against the entire novel.
I think Orwell does a great job of presenting that argument and succeeding at that argument.
I do really appreciate the choice that Orwell does to make O'Brien superior to Winston in every way, and that O'Brien is smarter, more willful, and in a higher position in society than Winston. And Winston is the failed, doomed protagonist who's up against just someone infinitely stronger than him in every regard. O'Brien's even physically larger and more imposing and more real than Winston. And Winston realizes this, and as the reader, we're looking over Winston's shoulder and watching this. So Orwell does take things to the extreme, but it's poignant the way he has O'Brien positioned and the character he builds him out to be, the mouthpiece for the party and the party's ideology. Which begs the next question here. When is being a lunatic and minority of one worth the cost? Because that is what's happening to poor Winston here.
When is it worth it? I don't know. That's hard to say. And very rarely are we put into these positions. And very rarely do we see these positions in history set in place.
Right. Martyrs for doomed causes. And that's what Winston is. And if O'Brien's to be believed, he won't even be able to be a martyr. He won't even be able to die for what he believes in, which is opposition to the party and individuality.
And the person I was thinking of in this case, again, we have few instances in history where this is actually a real question. Because for you and I, it's almost never going to come up in our lives to become a lunatic of one. But the Polish doctor, and I'm so sorry that I'm going to say this name wrong, it was Eugene Lazowski is who I was thinking of, and he was a Polish doctor in Nazi-occupied Germany at the time, and he faked a tuberculosis outbreak and saved over 1,000 Jewish people, expediting them out of the area. And he was, in some ways, a lunatic of one because in his life story and listening to a podcast about his life, he did amazing things. And he truly was like, at times, and I'm so sorry if I get this wrong, I'll have to fact check it in a second. He'd put himself in a position where he was wearing a doctor's coat and he was telling these Nazi officers that we have to get these people out of this area. Here's these papers, yada, yada, and move everything in a real quick, successive manner in order to save those people. And he was the only person thinking in that manner in a group of Nazi officers that could have killed him. In that case, right, most people in our modern moral standard would say that he was a successful lunatic of one.
That reminds me of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also was someone who was a Nazi dissident, who was a pastor, who also paid the price for his beliefs. Yeah.
Right.
A lot of stories like that came out of Nazi Germany.
Right. Where we have, yes, there were multiple people that thought that, but it wasn't the shared cultural narrative, right? The shared cultural narrative was the Nazi party at the time.
Right. Even if you didn't want to go along with it, your choice was go along or be crushed utterly.
Correct. And so we see these parts in our life showing being a lunatic of one was worth it for those heroes.
Now,
it was worth it.
Now the question occurs, was it worth it for Winston?
I think in some ways, in this case, Winston is winning a symbolic victory by trying to resist. And we also have that shown in, and again, heroes in our society, where we have some people dying for a belief, even though they didn't do or accomplish anything at the time.
For me, it's just the extra sad part of Winston's story is that he does get erased, and he gets worse than just executed while being a rebel in his mind. O'Brien specifically, kind of reads Winston and says, Winston, you're wondering why I'm continuing to torture you, even though you're going to be erased and you're going to be killed. It's an inevitability. You're wondering why me and the party are taking the trouble to break your mind. It's because we can't stand the idea of there being someone who's resisting us, even in their mind. So we talked about it earlier in the first episode of this discussion, that Winston dies long before he actually dies. He is tearing up at the very end of the novel, thinking to himself that he loves Big Brother, and the party won completely. And that's just, Orwell pulled that off very powerfully. And I think that's one of the many reasons why this novel has so much strength and staying power.
So with that, I think reality is external in our society as a collective shared perception. And what we consider normal or abnormal is kind of dictated by our society. And then eventually sanity or what is considered sane thought or normal thought is, again, mostly dictated by our society. We have our internal struggle, but we pick up so much from the people around us. We imitate so much from what's around us that it's really external.
I would agree with that our perceptions, our reality is our perception, and that our perception is made up by the people around us, just as more so than just the perceptual information that we are gathering and interpreting from our environment. Our environment, another way to put it is our environment is other people.
Right.
And if everyone's saying the sky is this color, that's the color it is.
What it's going to be, that's going to be the shared word for it. In our case, the word is blue.
Right.
We have this back and forth from O'Brien torturing Winston and then saying that he cares about him, and this good cop, bad cop, that's all encompassed by O'Brien. we see a particularly gruesome bout of torture. Quote, he opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien. At sight of the heavy, lined face, so ugly and so intelligent, his heart seemed to turn over. He had never loved him so deeply as at this moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The old feeling that at bottom, it's a weird sentence.
I got you.
That old feeling that at bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as be understood. End quote.
Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. Something that as the reader we watch Winston thinking during a particularly gruesome torture scene, further in the process of breaking Winston down, which brings up that idea of what he's saying here, love versus understanding. Have you read the book The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera? I think that'd be a great one for us to discuss and do an episode on. This idea reminds me of that, the difference between being understood and being loved. So I guess first thing here, what do you think of this complex relationship between O'Brien and Winston?
O'Brien's just doing his job and putting forth the party's agenda, which is to erase all rebellion, including the rebellion hidden deep inside of the hearts of dissenters. And Winston is living out his rebellion and slowly being broken down by torture.
But what do you think of that love that he has for O'Brien? And do you think it's reciprocal?
I think O'Brien loves the party and therefore loves the insertion of the party into another person. I don't think O'Brien loves Winston the individual. O'Brien loves the shell that Winston is.
The receptacle for correcting his thoughts.
And I think Winston is broken down completely, where he loves O'Brien in a Stockholm Syndrome-like fashion, where that's the only connection to humanity that he has, because O'Brien at least listens when Winston talks, even though none of it means anything, but he's the last thing there that he can talk to.
I did think of Stockholm Syndrome. It also seems to be something else as well, that Winston has no sources of comfort, but he's finding just the shadow of comfort in the idea that O'Brien understands him fully. You know, he's his torturer, but he's also feeling understood. He's feeling seen in a way that he hasn't felt seen before. It's an interesting dynamic that Orwell brings to the surface. And since we're on the subject of O'Brien, do you think O'Brien is meant to be a steelman argument for totalitarianism? Satirical? Both?
In this case, it's mostly satirical. I believe O'Brien here represents the extremity that Orwell puts inside of his writings for 1984. He is the far-flung hero of what totalitarian oppression really is. I don't know that I could call it a steelman argument or a strawman argument in any capacity, because I don't think he's arguing for this, or there's any evidence to say that this is a value to totalitarianism.
You're saying that O'Brien's not necessarily an advocate for, hey, totalitarianism's great.
Correct. Yeah, of course.
Right. In that way, I would agree. I do think that he is a powerful mouthpiece for this line of thinking, this end result of pursuing the acquisition of power for itself. It's not any type of ideology that I can see someone voluntarily falling into, but O'Brien follows it. And it's interesting because he's not at the pinnacle, but he's close to the pinnacle of the hierarchy here. I'm not sure what to make of that. It's just interesting that O'Brien is who he is and how he's portrayed.
Yeah, I think he's just a continuation of the cartoonishly extremism that is the whole theme of the book.
So next question, Joel, do you think it is more important to feel loved or to feel understood?
I think that's a case-by-case basis. Sometimes I want to be loved. Sometimes I want to be understood. Most of the time, both. And plenty of times I don't need either.
It depends on the relationship, right? If it's also the people closest to you, that if you feel misunderstood, if you feel misunderstood by a stranger, it kind of is what it is. But if you feel misunderstood by people that are close to you, that hurts more.
I think perhaps feeling misunderstood might come from a fear of being left out or a fear of being isolated. Because if you have someone close in your life and they're supposed to understand who you are, say like a spouse or a best friend or something like that, and they do an act or they say something that shows that they don't understand you, I think that can hearken on our innate fear of being isolated or being pushed out of the herd.
That's a good point. It brings it back to the fear of death.
Fear of death.
Being misunderstood brings you one step closer to the risk of dying. Yeah, like you said, being pushed out of the group, pushed out of the herd.
So it just depends. There's plenty of times where I'm perfectly happy with someone loving me and not understanding me.
Can you give me an example?
Like my wife sometimes, I'm like, you don't need to understand why I did this or I want to do this. You can just love and support me, and it can stop there. I don't need you to understand.
Okay. I can see that. I can see that. Any more thoughts here on this weird dynamic between these two men?
No. Do you have any feelings on being loved or understood that you want to share?
I would agree with the sentiment that it's more important to be understood than loved, and that there's, to a degree, you do need to be understood to be actually loved. But I also see what you're talking about, that you can be loved without being understood. Fun theme to explore, and I think it's in a future episode something we could cover much more in depth in Martin Buber's I and Thou, or Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which anyone out there who's listening has a preference to what we can cover or has another book that would be great for exploring that topic, please chime in and let us know what you think. So next up, let's talk about the idea that slavery is freedom, which is one of the slogans of the party. This is, again, we're pulling from the last part of the book here. This is O'Brien talking to Winston. Joel, would you like to read us what O'Brien is
O'Brien
dictating
to
here?
Winston, quote, "You know the party's slogan, freedom is slavery. Has it ever occurred to you that it is reversible? Slavery is freedom. Alone, free, the human being is always defeated. It must be so, because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape from his identity, if he can merge himself into the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal," end quote.
This is just the literary villain version of explaining the idea of an immortality project and being a part of something larger than yourself that we talked about in the conversation on denial of death.
This is the immortality project that O'Brien puts forth as his proposition to Winston. And understandable and completely logical. You're going to die. Why not be a part of something bigger that'll never die? And if you merge your identity with this identity, you therefore never die.
I think something that stands out to me here is his statement there that alone the human being is always defeated, and because the human being is doomed to die, death is the greatest failure. That's, for me, the connection that's happening in my mind right now is what we were talking about earlier, that emphasis on the material world being all there is. If that's how you see it and you deny any spirituality or any other type of greater power beyond materialism and power acquisition, then yes, death is a failure. But I would say that death is not a form of failure. Death is natural and not to be feared, at least not in the way that O'Brien is talking about here.
There are suppositions behind this, which is that there is no world after you die, meaning, like you said, the full incorporation of only a material world. And then there's also the idea that death is the greatest of all failures. which I think that's probably the easiest portion of his postulates to target, because I don't think death is the biggest failure. Death isn't necessarily a failure.
I think it's also essential to O'Brien's standpoint, because if you deny that part of it, if you disagree with that part of it, then that still gives Winston an out. Speaking of immortality projects, this, brings up the idea of what makes one better than the other. And is Winston exhibiting a kind of immortality project with his feudal rebellion?
Well, he tries to connect with Goldstein's opposition. There's the opposition to the party, and you can be a part of that movement. And in a way, you're then having your immortality project, which is hopefully to be part of that rebellion. So maybe you could see that as potentially an immortality project. We see the rise, especially in the 1700s and 1800s, the idea of nationalism really becoming a fervor. And in that way, we see that similar to this, where if you merge your identity with that of a nation, then you are being a part of a bigger collective that will continue on past you, which is one of the arguments for why people would join militaries of certain things, such as Napoleon's French army, right? You're a part of something greater. So even if you fall in battle, you are perpetuating Napoleon's empire, which will be greater, and you're honored amongst those. There's also great discourse on understanding why during ancient times, what was the purpose of being the first person over the ladder of a siege ladder into an enemy fort, because that person almost inevitably always dies.
Or being a part of the first charge, or
Right.
being at the spear point of a cavalry charge. Right.
Rational human without some type of immortality ideology would go into that willingly.
A fascinating subject. And again, immediately a book or two comes to mind where we could explore that idea further, of that state of being in extreme situations where giving up your life becomes secondary to the experience you're in. Being the first over the ladder, like you're saying, being the first over the trench wall, charging into the enemy. Yeah. What a beautiful...
So many crevices to fall into here. Orwell really opens up a chasm to explore here. And I think the last little connection to this quote, this freedom is slavery, we talked about it in the in-person, when does freedom become tyranny? And you often like to use the phrase tyranny of choice. You love that phrase.
Right. I don't know if I love that phrase, but yes, you've heard me think about and discuss that idea.
Which is a true thing. If there are too many choices, then you end up not making any choice, because you're stuck with an endless amount of possibilities. Whereas, say, being a traditional college student going to classes, you just got to choose in between this many classes that you can take this semester. Much easier. Much, much easier.
Right. Here's your narrowed set of options to choose from.
Narrowed set of options. Sometimes much better than having an infinite amount of options.
Okay, last thing that I wanted to talk about, Joel, is the idea of hope. This is a bleak book with an unhappy ending. The whole of part 3 encompasses Winston's horrific ordeals in the lightless depths of the ministry of love, where he's broken down completely. He's entirely converted by O'Brien, and then he's released in a false semblance of life out into public life to be forgotten, eventually killed. He loves Big Brother to the very end, and Winston's destruction is more complete than death, and the party seems to win, absolutely. On that dark note, what do you see any hope out of this book? Do you see any glimmers of hope?
I think the real symbol of hope here is not in the book, but it's the book itself standing as a warning to say the hope is to not go down this route. The hope is that readers and everyone else sees the true terrors of war and the true terrors of totalitarianism, and to avoid this at all costs. And I think that's the hope there. Don't make this happen.
Right, right. Well, this is something we'll talk about a little bit later. One thing you said, and that it's my thought on this as well, is that the existence of the book 1984 itself is hopeful. That is the hope.
Right. That's the hope. And I think that's part of the reason why it became so popular at the time when it was published just after World War II, that all of these people had a much greater hope to not ever go through that again. I mean, the terrors and horrors of World War I weren't even that long ago or forgotten by the time World War II came around with even greater devastation.
And then all the horrors of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain.
That's the hope, I guess.
That would be my thought as well. That's that the book exists, that we can read that book, that we're able to read that book, that exists, that Orwell could write it, and we still have it, almost 100 years later.
Right. So that's our hope. Winston's ultimate worse than death existence, which is to come to love the party, to have all rebellion eradicated from his heart, mind, and soul in its totality, shows a bigger picture of totalitarianism wiping out humanity in it of itself inside of each individual.
Right. Even if a single instance of humanity is snuffed out, that the story keeps going.
Right.
And there's always the chance the story, the next chapter, to be better than the last.
Yeah, that's what I got.
That's what I've got too.
Okay, great. In that case, we'll take one final break, and then we'll come back together and close out this book with what's starting to become some of my favorite parts, which is our closing narrative for all of our episodes.
Who's the fool now?
And we're back. What a wonderful deep dive into a beautiful discussion of 1984. I can't believe, after all this time, having come full circle around the entire discourse of what Orwell has brought to us, and I want to give our overall opinions. And you know what? I guess I thought it was a great book. It was over the top, which was the whole point of Orwell's writings. And it took a lifetime of experiences to create this book. And I think it's a beautiful piece of work. What do you think, Leo?
I don't know that I'd use the phrase over the top for it, because that has a negative connotation. I think he takes totalitarianism to the extreme, and he takes aspects of it to the extreme. Over the top doesn't fit for some reason for me. I'd have to think about that. My overall opinion, though, is I love this book. I've been reading it for, I don't know, multiple decades of my life now. This being the third visit, I'm sure it won't be the last. Every time I read it, something else stands out, or some new thought occurs, and that's the mark of great literature. This is an example of what can really be done with the novel as a device.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a great piece of work. I guess the word cartoonish comes to mind only in the fact that cartoons, you can really extrapolate and accentuate ideas to the extreme that you couldn't do with traditional cinematography. And that's just what it feels like here, is that we take something to the extreme to really discuss the nuances of what it means. Almost like you take something small and you zoom in, so to speak, or extrapolate that out to discuss the discourse.
I can understand that. So you want to run through some quotes? You gathered a few quotes here from the book.
So brought in a few quotes from the book that kind of stuck with me as we read through it. And they're all going to be quotes. So, quote, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength," end quote. And those are the party slogans.
The 3 party slogans, one of which was exhibited by Brian, freedom is slavery. We haven't talked about the other 2 in our discussions here, but war is peace, ignorance is strength. Those are, ignorance is strength being doublethink and slimming down the intellectual choices that you have through the winnowing of the English language into Newspeak. War is peace, and that the status quo is perpetually maintained by the unending wars between the superstates.
Great. Another one that really stuck with me, and it makes me think about our modern era, is, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," end quote.
Yeah, I really like that one as well. Next one you have on here, perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as understood, which we talked about. I really like that one. I'm glad you put that one in here.
I think it's a great one to think about because we had a really deep discussion on, being understood or being loved.
Next one, and this we talked about in the beginning of the first discussion, is if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And that's the picture that the party paints and the picture that O'Brien illustrates for Winston.
Again, just Orwell's life experiences seeping through the pages, dripping from all of his experience, both fighting in the Spanish Civil War and seeing some of the totalitarianism, both on the fascist side and on the Stalin-led communist side.
Next one. Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them.
And watch, we see doublethink show up in our lexicon today and remains a key phrase that we still use.
Another one is power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them back together again in new shapes of your own choosing, which is what the Ministry of Love was doing, which is what O'Brien was doing to Winston.
Or how we reshape events that happen in today's society to fit whatever narrative that the current political party wishes to push forward.
Next one, in the face of pain, there are no heroes.
According to O'Brien, everyone breaks eventually.
And that you can't be a hero if you're in the throes of agony. We looking at a story of someone being in pain or being in agony, we can create a narrative that involves heroics and winning and defeat and victory. But there's a undeniable reality to pain, and pain of a sufficient level just encompasses all of reality. And I think that's a very apt thing that is being pointed out here by Orwell.
Great. I think that's great. I think those are quotes that really stick with us nowadays. Are you okay? My takeaways from this book is not only is it a warning against totalitarianism, staying away from far-right extremist groups on the right and the left, it's also takeaways of the human psyche of needing to be an individual and sometimes having your own rebellion and questioning when is it good to be a minority of one.
For me, the takeaway is mostly that grim warning of what can happen. The freedoms we have, the world we have, the level of humanity and peace that we have, even though it ebbs and flows, can all be taken away. They could always be much worse, and it's something that needs to be protected. It's not just a foregone conclusion. It's not something we can take for granted. And this ultimate dystopian novel is a great reminder. It's a great metaphor to have in mind of worst case scenario of what can happen when a revolution gets co-opted and goes down a dark path. You want to read through the critiques?
Great. Okay, so that's our takeaways. Let's read what other people thought of as takeaways. And of course, we'll start with the negative bad reviews, the good bad reviews. And by good, I mean entertaining. And of course, I got these from Goodreads because my gosh, isn't it fun to just get this? But also sometimes some of the bad reviews we read do make me think about some good instances in a book that maybe need to be pointed out. So for this, I wanted to preface it with there was about 5.5 million reviews on Goodreads, and only about 1% of them were 1-star ratings. So I tried to boil some of these down, and I avoided meaningless reviews, because sometimes a review would just say bad, 1 star, nothing else. Others said misogynistic, 1 star, no other comment, or anything like that. George Orwell wouldn't have liked me because I'm a woman, 1 star. That was it. And so there's nothing to really engage with there. There's no value. So the first collection of reviews that I read was roughly, the book is a classic, so people pretend to like it to seem cool or intellectual. Quote from a reviewer: I wrote in my status, meaning Facebook, that I was reading 1984. Anyone have any opinions? Almost everyone of the commenters wrote how much they enjoyed this book and how it was one of their favorite books ever. While I am sure that maybe one of them was being truthful, I have to doubt at least half of them. Now I ask, why do people lie about certain books? Do they think it makes them look smarter, cooler, well-rounded? I just don't get it. If you don't like something, you don't like it. It's not necessary to like it for classic book's sake. End quote.
Meaning, I suppose, from this this review, that you're not supposed to just automatically like classic books because they're classics. So, okay, I guess.
In their review, they even say most people said that they liked it and it was one of their favorite books. And she's like, oh, they're just lying.
Right. So you pulled this from Goodreads?
Goodreads, yeah.
Okay.
Goodreads. And again, about 1% of the 5.5 million reviews was a 1 star.
Understandable. I mean, there's very little to critique about this book. It's a classic for a reason. I understand that sentiment. I frequently encounter the book Ulysses by, what's his name? Not the Greek epic, the one about the Irishman. Ulysses. James Joyce. Ulysses by James Joyce. So I've taken a stab at Ulysses. It's come up on many, many lists of one of the greatest classics ever written, and I just could not get into it. I'll take another stab, I'm sure, but to me it was just boring and terrible. And I had that initial reaction of, well, it's a classic. It's so many people say it's one of the greatest books ever written. What am I doing wrong to not get into it? And it just wasn't for me. Just was not for me, and I'm okay with that. But maybe I'll take another dive into it, and maybe I will like it. There's been several books like that where I had to do a second or third attempt at it to actually enjoy it, and I actually enjoyed it. Melville's Moby Dick was like that, where first time I read it was pure torture, and then the second time, like, I got it. It clicked. It made sense for me, and I deeply enjoyed it. Two wildly different experiences, same book. And I did have that idea of like, well, it's a classic. You're supposed to like it. So I get, I guess, one of the sentiments that this reviewer's pointing at here.
Yeah, it's okay to not like something, even though it's a classic. I think Citizen Kane, for example, is a film that's touted as one of the greatest cinematography pieces of art, but I didn't necessarily enjoy it.
I haven't seen it yet. It's definitely on my to-watch list. I'd heard a description of one of the camera tricks that was used in it that I'm really interested in looking at.
Yeah, I'm glad it exists. I'm happy for its position in cinematography history, but I didn't thoroughly enjoy it, and that's okay.
And that is okay.
But I don't think it's okay for this person to think that only one person of the many people that commented that they were telling the truth about them liking the book, and everyone else was just lying so that they seemed cool or smart.
Reading this is an instance of, this is a digression, but this is an instance of what I call talking just to talk. This person's just making negative sounding noises to put something on digital paper. I don't know that there's much of substance being said here. But the general thrust, you're using this as an example of the general thrust of a theme of
yes. I was just
dislikes and bad reviews.
One review of many. Again, I try.
Right.
This is 20, 30 reviews I read, kind of boiled down to one, and I picked one that as a representation.
Okay.
So the next group of critiques that I read was maybe it was great when it came out, but it didn't age well and it's too graphic. Quote from, again, a reviewer from Goodreads. If you're considering reading this book, please note that it contains graphic thoughts of rape, self-harm, suicide, and torture. You have almost certainly encountered some of the language invented in this book in your daily life and not realized it. It must have been a game changer on many fronts. However, time dulls political satire. The use of the word comrade doesn't strike fear into my Russian-hating heart. End quote.
I'm assuming that last sentence was meant to be satirical or a bit of a joke, but let's start with the graphic nature here. So this is something we did not touch on, and maybe it's something we could have added to the discussion. It's definitely something that did occur to me. There is a high level of brutality and violence and just grim, brutal reality in the book. Everyone within the book is surrounded by brutality and violence in a real and painful way. At one point, Winston hears a bomb whistling in the air. There's just part of everyday life that bombs drop on London every now and then. And people have to duck for cover, and then as soon as the dust clears, people move on with their lives. At one point, he's walking down the street. A bomb comes in. He dives to take cover. When the dust clears, he gets up and continues walking on his way along with everybody else. And there's a severed human hand in front of him, and he just kind of unthinkingly just kicks it out of the way. Just doesn't give it a second thought, just keeps going about his business. And if that were to happen to anyone living in a modern, not war-torn country, you would be thinking about that for the rest of your lives. And for Winston, it's an everyday occurrence. There's a severed human hand. There's people are turned into splatters and obliterated in front of them. People get disappeared constantly. There are thoughts and language about rape. Suicide, I think also comes up. Self-harm, I'm not sure, but there's torture for sure. I mean, the whole last third of the book is one unending horrific torture after another. It is gruesome and grim, and that I don't think Orwell was being graphic for the sake of being graphic. I really don't like gore and gruesomeness for its own sake as a thing that brings people to a medium. That's not what I saw here. That's not what I got out of this. There was a purpose for the gruesomeness and the grimness and the violence.
That part of the critique is authentic. It is graphic. There is a lot of gruesome scenes there that could easily be too much or overwhelming, especially for young readers. And that part's true. It is definitely not like I would consider the Saw movie series, which is gruesome just to be gruesome. It is gross and overly bloody just for the sake of that.
Right. It is the point.
That is the point, and there's nothing else.
In this book, it is a point.
Yeah, that point is used to put forth the political agenda and the essays that Orwell has here. It is a device. And
it's real. I mean, these things happened during World War II. These things happened in Iron Curtain countries during Soviet oppression.
Yeah.
This
is a reality.
Brutal.
And how do you capture the brutality of this in a less banal way without being authentic? I'm sure there's works that capture that, but that's not the point of Orwell's writing here.
And you can't have the type of society that's being described here without this level of brutality.
Right. And in response to the other section, which is time dulls political satire, blah, 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 I think it aged perfectly well. I think 1984 is still a relevant piece of work today, even 75 years into the future. It's still a valuable piece of literature that can provide for people this idea of what the cost and price is of totalitarianism.
Painfully relevant. It's painfully topical.
Right. And even though the setting is slightly different, then because there were different players. Orwell still makes it a little bit timeless because he has super states develop, and he has themes of, for example, unending war or propaganda. These kinds of things are timeless. I mean, we still had propaganda 2,000 years ago during the Roman Empire. Their use of propaganda we still have present, or we still have records of.
It is amazing to think about the fact that this book was written in a time when the fictitious time in the story, 1984, was still decades away in the time it was written. 49, right? The book was written in 49. And it's a past future for us. Here we are in the 2020s, and the year 1984 is past, but the world of 1984 is still a possible future. I don't think it's aged poorly whatsoever. I disagree completely with that.
Yeah, but it is, and like we talked about at the top of the first episode, it is important to understand the political sphere that was present at the time that it was published. And I think that's a useful tool for getting a deeper meaning from the book. Great. Okay. And then the last kind of collection of critiques that I read was, the book is slow and boring. From another reviewer, quote, people call this book deep and thought-provoking, but for me, it was just exhausting and boring. If you enjoy feeling trapped in a gray, hopeless world for no real payoff, this might be for you. Otherwise, this is one classic I wish I could unread, end quote.
That's an amazing review right there. Take a look at that sentence that says, if you enjoy feeling trapped in a gray, hopeless world. The book is not enjoyable in that way. It's not a good time. You're not on a fun theme park ride to be entertained. It's not like that. It's not fun to read about a man getting tortured and being oppressed and losing his mind and disintegrating, and to see people reduced to having a secret love affair as their only means of expressing their individuality and the little bit of humanity they have left, clinging to humanity. It's not fun. It's beautiful in the way that literature is beautiful, but it is very ugly. The people are even ugly. There's not one person in the book who's described as beautiful. There's not one thing other than some instances of seeing the natural world outside of the city that's described as beautiful. Everything is ugly, worn down, especially the people.
It's no Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants.
I haven't read it.
Neither have I, but I imagine it's a happier setting than this. Or Eat, Pray, Love. It's no Eat, Pray, Love where someone gets to be on a mystical, magical, personal journey.
Is that an actual book? I thought that was just like...
It's a book.
A piece of... Okay, all right. But feeling trapped in a gray, hopeless world, I think, is part of the point. Much like Melville's Moby Dick, feeling like a bored sailor trapped on a boat is part of the experience of the book. So for me, that is one of the main points of the book is feeling trapped and gray and hopeless.
In the same theme and direction, this book reminds me of A Modest Proposal, if you remember that.
I don't.
All right. Okay. This whole book makes me feel that it's in the same theme as A Modest Proposal, which was a essay by Jonathan Swift. And very short. It's a very short read. It's a very short summary. We could eat children for nutrition at the time. And it was a satirical pick at Britain basically decimating Irish countryside and taking a very brutal stance towards the Irish population. We don't need to get into it, but its whole point was to be this overly dark or overly grim kind of setting to highlight a point. In this case, Orwell really highlights the brutality of totalitarianism, and I think it's very authentic and true. So is it gray? I wouldn't call it gray. It's definitely dark. Hopeless? I don't know. I think the last portion of the book kind of gives its own hope that we talked about. The book existing is a hope in itself.
There's a bleakness and a hopelessness to it. As far as this reviewer saying the book is slow and boring, it's not a thriller. There are slower parts.
There's whole essays, hidden inside of the book.
Right. It's also not a long book. It's a fairly short novel.
In one of the recent books that we read, this is definitely unlike Project Hail Mary, or what people would describe as a page turner, where you just can't wait to get to the next part of the plot to uncover the mystery.
Not to denigrate Project Hail Mary, but this is not an easily digestible, bite-sized piece of entertainment.
Right.
Yeah.
What we're saying from, or at least what I'm speaking of, hearing you and I talk, is from the collection of critiques that I read. Yes, the book's a classic. It's okay to like a classic book. It's also okay not to like a classic book. I think it aged just fine. It is very graphic, though. It is dark, and in some cases, it's not easily digestible. So these are all things that, gosh, if you made it to the end of part 1 and part 2, thanks for being here. But it's a great book regardless. There are graphic, dark themes inside of it. And on the fun side, just because I was getting into and I read so many reviews while I was getting the bad reviews, that I wanted to insert some good reviews that I read. And one of them, I think it was the most thumbed up review. It was a huge essay in Arabic that detailed the rise of totalitarian governments in the Middle East that lament the reality of the book that was coming to fruition inside of those governments, and them wanting more people to read it and understanding the true brutality and propaganda machines that some totalitarian governments have in the Middle East. And this is this reviewer writing it. Of course, I had to Google translate his review, but it was almost a beautiful miniature essay in it of itself, praising the book.
I like that. I'd like to read that. When going through our notes here, in this section, I dropped in a picture of a hat that says, "Make Orwell Fiction Again." And I encountered this hat in real life for the first time 10 years ago now, when I was working at the company I was working for at the time. There was this guy who was in charge of building maintenance, and I saw him wearing this hat. And this is a Charles Dickens character of a man. He would corner me every time he had the chance and talk to me about conspiracy theories and what governments were doing and this, that, and the other. And then one day I saw him wearing this hat, and it was perfect. It was perfect to see this hat. Make Orwell fiction again. And unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of truth to that 1984 was meant to be a warning and not a playbook.
Yeah, I've seen that meme on the internet where it says 1984 was meant to be a warning, not a manual or playbook. Or
right.
Whatever, and that's very fun. Quote, "This book is far from perfect. Its characters lack depth. Its rhetoric is something didactic. Its plots, well, half of it anyway, was lifted from
Zumyatin.
And the lengthy Goldstein treatise shoved into the middle is a flaw which alters the structure of the novel like a scar disfiguring a face. But in the long run, all that does not matter because George Orwell got it right." So this was a 5-star review where this person points out what he thinks falls short of being beautiful literature, but ultimately agrees with the message that Orwell's presenting.
I like this review. I don't know what book he's referencing there.
Nope.
Zumyatin's We. I would love to read about that and do some digging around to read about that. I also would love to investigate the claim that it was lifted. Either way, I like the fact that there's real content to this review. That's an interesting statement that the Goldstein writings are, he calls it a disfiguring scar. That's something I read about doing research. I didn't put it in here to our notes. When I was researching the background of this book and the reception of this book at its time and its academic history, that is something that critics have gone back and forth on in this book, is the inclusion of the Goldstein writings and adds to the book, or it takes away from the book, it breaks the narrative, it does this, it does that. My personal opinion is that I'm glad it's in there. I appreciate the device that it is, the way it's in there. I love a good story within a story. I love framing narratives. And it's not the most elegantly executed thing, but there's not much that's elegant about the book. Some of the turns of phrases, some of the images are done elegantly, even if they're painting ugliness itself. But I don't have a problem with the Goldstein writings in the book. I like their presence. I like them being in there.
It's no Terry Pratchett or Mark Twain where there's beautiful things where I feel like someone's painting with words, where you can walk away with one-liners that stick with you, right?
Right.
There's no beautiful, beautiful literature works like Mark Twain would write. Still great, though.
Absolutely.
Last good review I wanted to share. Quote, "You are the dead. Oh my God. I got the chills so many times towards the end of this book. It completely blew my mind. It managed to surpass my high expectations and be nothing at all like what I expected. Or in Newspeak, double plus good."
I'm glad that this review exists. That's a fun one.
Anyways, I wanted to share those just because I read so many. Well, that's a lot. We did a lot. This was a great book. I'm glad we tackled this book. It was longer than I thought it'd be, but it was a great topic and one of my favorite books.
Easily one of my favorite books. So, friends, dear listeners, thank you very much for going with us on this discussion. We would love to hear your thoughts. There's many directions we can go next on what books to cover. Please reach out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Message us on Instagram, on X, Instagram. Leave a comment on the YouTube channel, wherever you want. Find us. We're out there. Reach out to us. Let us know what your thoughts are. What did you think of 1984? Where has it found you in your life? And what other books would you like to see us tackle next? We have a whole list, and your book might be on there or it might not. So just let us know.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Really glad you get to be a part of this community. And we look forward to bringing you another episode next week.
Bye, guys.